so bad, I get a little wet water. And then they got something on the sidewalk that helped make the extra curve. That's what he said. Kind of 60,000 miles. Hey, he does it every other oil change. Yep. Now he does his synthetic ones. That's what he does in every month. It's free rotation with what the tires.
A lot of people.
Good evening. Since it's 6 o'clock, we'll get started. Linda Johnson, could you please give the invocation?
Let's bow our heads. Dear holy and righteous Father, I thank you that you govern the affairs of men, that you are in all, you are through all, and you are over all. We invite your presence here tonight as you impart wisdom and discernment to each one of these council members as they make decisions regarding the issues at hand. You have called each one of them for this time to serve your purposes for this city. I ask you to remove from them the fatigue of the day and strengthen and refresh in them as they fulfill their assignments for this night. Open their ears to hear, their eyes to see, and their hearts to know your heart for this city as they choose what is best for all according to your plans. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you, Linda. So we'll officially call this Committee of the Whole meeting to order. Madam Clerk, would you please take the roll?
Mayor Miller,
Here.
Alderpersons Borneman,
Here.
McClanathan,
Here.
Ross,
Here.
Parker,
Here.
Busker,
Here.
Brashaw,
Here.
Mysick,
Here.
and Burberry is absent.
And if you could please stand and join us for the Pledge of Allegiance led by Tom Tyke. And so this meeting will be led by Alderman Borneman.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, Council. First item here is number 4, approval of the agenda. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
And seconded.
So McClanathan, Bradshaw, seconded by McClanathan, it sounded like. Any discussion? And do we need a roll for this? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, motion to approve the agenda carries. Moving on, approval of minutes from the Committee of Whole meeting held on September 9th, 2019.
Motion to approve.
Busker approval, followed by Mysick second. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? And the motion to approve minutes of that meeting carries. Next is public comment, limited to 3 minutes per person. We have Mr. John Hill here. If you'd like to step up to the microphone, please. Just do us a favor and state your name and where you're from, and try your best to speak into the microphone.
All right, my name is John Hill. I am from Freeport, and I have a comment on ordinance 2019, chapter 626. If we go to page 7, under the heading, and I know we haven't discussed this yet, but it states using cannabis, item F, in any public place. To me, that's a little unclear, especially with what I see and hear happening throughout the country with cannabis cafes. The state of Colorado just recently passed a state law governing cafes. They also passed a state law regarding delivery of marijuana products. So I'm thinking that perhaps this is a little bit broad in scope, saying in any public place, when perhaps you want to look at it down the road and say, based upon a future licensing program from the city of Freeport. So, only comment, I haven't had a chance to read all the ordinances, but I think that statement is a little broad. So, My opinion.
All right, thank you, Mr. Hill. That is our only public comment, so we'll move on to item number 7. This is a presentation of the annual report and comprehensive economic development strategy presented by Blackhawk Regional Council.
Good evening, everybody. My name's Dan Payette. I'm with Blackhawk Hills Regional Council. I want to start by first thanking the city manager for getting me on the agenda and scheduling that, so thank you. Before I move on with the presentation, I want to point out the items in front of you include our annual report. Within the annual report is a promotional item for our October summit. That's something we put on twice a year, and we look forward to your attendance if it's at all possible. We've got some good speakers lined up. And then the last item is the SEDS document, which I'll talk about at length here. All right. So I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of Blackhawk Hills Regional Council and then also talk about the SEDS document. I'm going to take 1 second to see if I can get a full screen for this. There we go. There we go. All right. So Blackhawk Hills, for those of you unfamiliar with our organization, we started in '74. We started as a resource conservation and development district, and since then have broadened our focus and what we give our attention to. It includes Stevenson County, but then 5 other counties in Northwest Illinois. Each of the counties has 3 representatives, one from the county board, one from the Soil and Water Conservation District, and then a joint appointment from the Soil and Water Conservation Districts. We work on a number of issues, but our general areas that we cover are community and economic development, natural resources conservation, that's our legacy contribution there, and then planning and technical assistance for local communities, so working through plans and so on, whatever they might be doing, generally on the county and municipal level. This is essentially some of the work items that we've done over the last couple of years and in recent history. I want to point out that we worked with the county and the city and really all the municipalities in Stevenson County to update the hazard mitigation plan a few years ago, and that was a good effort by all locals to engage in, again, in making sure that document is relevant and recent. I'm going to talk about the SEDS, and although I will note on the bottom we are involved in the enterprise zone, that's typically for Lee and Ogle counties, but we have provided technical assistance in the past. I know for East Dubuque, when the zone was expanded years ago, we helped them with some mapping and so on. So you can always use this as a resource for those kind of things. Another point, we have a rudimentary grants portal on our website. We're working to add those as they come in, and we find them to be relevant for the region, but we're trying to keyword them so you can look for areas that would be important to you. The other initiative that we've been involved with for a pretty long time is the iFiber, the Illinois Fiber Resources Group, which has a nearly 900-mile fiber optic network throughout Northwest Illinois. We continue to do outreach for that. If you've ever been curious about where that network is, you can go to the interactive map and actually put in an address and figure out if the network's close to you. Now that we've connected a lot of the so-called community anchor institutions, we are connecting at this point, or working with private sector, private service providers to connect residences, businesses, and so on. So anybody can use the network that is private sector providers and sell their services to local entities and so on. So we're working both angles. All right, so the 2019-2024 SEDS. I mentioned that obviously we're engaged in community and economic development. One of our connections is to the Economic Development Administration. They're the ones that we have to supply the SEDS report to. The recent one that was published and is in front of you today was handed off to EDA, they approved it and so on, but it's a fairly comprehensive process, and we're setting goals and objectives throughout that with the partners in the region, attempting to come up with consensus items that individual communities and the counties can work on, even if their plans are obviously going to be different depending on what their needs are. It also enables access to funding from the Economic Development Administration, public works grants, so infrastructure on the ground, technical assistance. If you wanted to do a feasibility to test the waters, whether something was a good idea or not, you might want to apply for a grant to help you pay for something like that. And even recently, other grants, they released a special pool of funding from EDA, an 80-20 grant for disaster-impacted counties, Stevenson County being one of those. So Again, participation in the SEDS allows for application from into the EDA. Again, we went through the SEDS process. We have a board. We also have a board essentially for the SEDS, the Regional SEDS Committee, and then we had public input from various meetings throughout the region. So I'm going to talk very briefly about the document sections, but essentially it's lined up in data and then descriptions of the area and then essentially an implementation plan, goals, action items, and so on. But we talk a lot about the region and where we've been and where we are today and where we anticipate that being in the future. One of the things I want to point out with this slide is this shows you the 6-county population. Stevenson County is in the blue, so the second one from on the top, Whiteside County being on the green. I think one of the things to note is that we ran a population projection, and a very basic one. A lot of things can impact that, especially when you look out as far as 2050. But you're seeing in 2050 a population that is roughly the size of what the region was in the 1940s. So that's something important to note. I think we generally know that population is declining, but it is an issue that impacts our ability to attract employers, to fill existing jobs, to be able to have creative energies to do things in town. You need people to do that. So that's an issue going forward. I will point out that we're not going to be able to solve this problem with our own people. That is, we don't have huge families. We aren't having a lot of babies. So that either has to come from domestic migration or international immigration. But in order to sustain where we are today, we would have to look to those sources. This is showing a general population map for the region that Black Hawk Hills covers. Obviously, Freeport, the biggest community in the region, followed by Dixon, Sterling, Rock Falls, and Rochelle areas. This next one is showing you a change in population. Normally, there would be some green in there showing you some growth, but what this is actually showing you is that between the years of 2010 and 2017, the entire region's all the municipalities lost population. There are varying degrees of those percentages, all the way up to around 7%. But again, everybody lost population. And this isn't to just be Chicken Little about what our future is, but it is a recognition that this is an issue that our region is facing wholly, either at the county or the municipal level. This is giving you a comparison of Stevenson County's median household income, United States being the black bar, the grayish bar at the end, Illinois. So Stevenson County is on the lower end compared to our existing counties and then other entities. I also want to point out that while there was growth in income, you can see the bar shows you essentially at 44,572, and then that increased by 2017 a couple $1,000s. But one of the things you have to consider is, though, even though there was growth, a lot of that is wiped out by inflation. So what looks like growth may not actually be real growth. So it's something to keep in mind when you're trying to figure out, did workers earn more money over time? This is showing you median household income. What we can do here is, since we're in a tri-state area, Northwest Illinois, Southwest Wisconsin, East Central Iowa, we made comparison to the economic development districts of other counties. So there's 5 in Iowa, there's 5 counties in Wisconsin, and then there's ours, which has 6 counties. And this is just giving you a sense of where the counties are for median household income when you add the other states. This is showing you unemployment. We obviously peaked out during the Great Recession. Those levels have fallen back and back to what one might call in some economic circles full employment. But that means that there might be other things going on too, where people that were in the workforce may have left permanently and aren't counted by that. It might mean that somebody's working a job they don't really want, and they might want to be in a different position, or they might want to earn more money, and so on. It also means that when an employer is looking to move to a region, if they don't see the availability of workforce, then it's much harder for them to justify potential investment and movement and so on. So again, this is where population becomes an issue. Job creation and destruction over a roughly 6-7 year period. This is showing you what industries are really growing and which ones have really trailed off. The top one on trailing off, printing services, that was impacted, if some of you are familiar with Mount Morris in Ogle County with the printing industry death. So there have been some other manufacturing entities or industries that have fallen off, but then we start to see growth in other manufacturing. The big one maybe because it's more obvious, the small electric goods has to do with Wall in Sterling. And obviously food processing is very critical to Stevenson County with Berner and so on. And the cheese factory is not too far away. But this is showing what you might have thought the region did maybe is not the same or true today. I want to point out the difference between local and traded clusters. So you have traded right there. Traded is when you have a relationship with somebody from outside of your region. So it's bringing wealth in that didn't previously exist in a locality. Again, we're looking at 6 counties, not just Stevenson County. This is a lump of that. But traded is important, again, because you're generating wealth that wasn't here. And so you like to see jobs in these industries because they tend to pay a little bit more. And again, you see where those jobs are today. And obviously some of these track with the jobs created and destroyed over the years. But you have quite a lot of people still in manufacturing and so on. But then you also see tourism still plays a role in the region and so on. Local clusters, again, these are important. These tend to be, so health services. These are industries that exist to essentially support those that are here to work in traded clusters and so on. Again, those generate value and wealth, but that tends to circulate within the region rather than establishing trade relationships to the outside. One of the things I wanted to do, and in general with the report, is make the point that industrial diversification is important. So just because you're really good at agriculture doesn't mean that you'll stay good at it if you keep doing the same thing. So one of the things we wanted to point out is that the region in some ways has looked to diversify just by, say, looking at honey production or organic sales. And whatever you think about organic production, it is a way to market what you grow very differently from what might be a standard commodity crop and so on. And there tends to be more money associated with the sale of those goods and so on. So one of the things that we really want to look at, and when I say we, the region really, is how can industry, how can business and so on diversify what they do to make more money, to hire more workers and so on. I'm going to skip past the vision, but just highlight the fact that we're really trying to look at it more than just how are we attracting businesses. No, we need to focus on other things that involve quality of life and so on. And I'll skip past this slide too. These are some of the traded clusters, either ones that we're good at right now or ones that we want to attract to the area. Obviously, manufacturing is going to be a continually important part of our economy. Agriculture doesn't have a lot of jobs, but again, it supports some of the manufacturing industries. And then you're starting to see diversification potentially through ongoing investments in energy production and the reinvestment that MetLife made in Freeport. Okay, so this finally gets to the goals section. We're nearing the end here, but we really wanted to focus or try to tighten our focus to 4 areas. And one is essentially can be summed up as regionalism, looking to places where we can actually grow as a region and use each other's resources effectively. One of the reasons this is important because it's really hard to break through the ether of the news media or whatever else to say, hey, we're here, we're good. So you really then have to start saying, okay, how do I think of Freeport as it relates to the region? So how does it relate to Lena? How does it relate to Galena and so on? Really the only community in the area that has name recognition, and that's for tourism, is Galena within the area. Beyond that, you have a little bit more with Rochelle because of some of its infrastructure assets, but it's very hard to communicate a message otherwise. So you need to start to essentially position yourself or look to position yourself when you can as a region to try to sell yourself. Because if somebody's coming in for a day trip, they might think, oh wait, I'm just going to go to Galena, but there's nothing else there. So you have to tie in a narrative and say, hey, no, there's actually some interesting things that happen in Freeport, and there's a stagecoach trail, and so on. Preserving, expanding, and investing in the workforce. Workforce is really critical right now. You have to have what you have, and you're not necessarily having people grow in to replace that. And you also need the skills there in order to support the jobs of the future. The next point being local economy, diversifying that economy. Again, not just looking, you don't want to not help a business that wants to move to your area, but you particularly want to look at preserving and expanding those that are here because they tend to be your biggest cheerleaders too, or the ones that make investments in other aspects of your community. And then finally, diversifying the local economy. Again, not just relying on the industries you might have relied on in the past, not discouraging them, but again, supporting them. And then quality of life. People more so today may be inclined to move to a region not because of a job, but because of something they like about it. And while you can't replicate Denver's mountains, there are other assets to the region that can be sold and be added to, whether it be recreational, dining, so on, that can support people. And things like maybe as basic, but sometimes overlooked as childcare for workers and so on. So you're supporting the workforce, you're giving them options, you're making it so they recognize that this is a good community to live in. And that concludes my presentation. I'd certainly take any questions if you have them, and I can certainly field them outside of this meeting. But thanks for the opportunity to present this evening. I do appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Payette. So I guess with that, we'll open it up to council with any questions or comments.
Chair.
Mr. McClanathan?
Thank you. Taking obviously the information and the data compiled, and then also you had mentioned briefly grants in regards to that. What's the main steps that the organization takes when in order the takeaways that you guys do moving forward once you've collected this data?
Well, so there's a number of action items contained within the report, and I guess I would split it three ways. There are things that Black Hawk Hills does, there are things that Black Hawk Hills and other partners do, and then there are things that other partners are doing. So the document might include something that the Workforce Board is already working on, but we feel it's important to highlight because we need to acknowledge that that's an issue, and that the issue well tailored to deal with that is the Workforce Board when you're dealing. So we're going to do less with workforce than say we would be doing with quality of life issues. And a good example would be, we've got this ongoing trails study for Northwest Illinois. Another component of that, beyond just what are the conditions, the quality, the use of the trails actually tracking people, we've also commissioned a wayfinding guide for the region. The idea being there is that you want to have some consistency in the signage in Galena as you would in Freeport, as you would in Sterling. You're not going to brand the same way necessarily, but again, that's addressing some of the quality of life issues. So I guess my quick answer to your question would be that we try to slice off what we can do and achieve as an organization that is primarily focused on planning and grant writing. So if there are projects, for instance, industrial park development, an attempt to assess housing throughout the region and what's needed and so on, we would support the community either do that, or if the community's like, yeah, we don't really have the capacity to do that, then work on their behalf to do that. I will say that everything that is included in the SEDS is not going to be achievable in the 5 years that the SEDS attempts to address. But we do hope to work on some of the things that tend to be of most importance, again, related not necessarily just to workforce, but to quality of life that maintains the workforce here.
I had a question for you, just with regard to, obviously, all of us sitting at the table here understand what Black Hawk Hills Regional Council is. To the listening public, they might be unfamiliar with what you're talking about.
Sure.
So could you kind of break down what the role your organization plays in?
Yeah, so back to the point of kind of the focus areas, economic development, natural resources, and so on. We started as what's called the Resource Conservation and Economic Resource Conservation and Development District. In '92, we added what's called an Economic Development District to the area that the 6 counties cover, and that was an EDA recognition. So beyond the SEDS document that I'm talking about here that we put together as our responsibilities, we also, again, work on the grants related to EDA implementation and so on. The third really prong of a three-pronged fork would be we're a regional planning organization, which means we provide planning assistance. So that's everything from a trails study to a freight study to a housing study and so on. And again, the idea is not to actually be necessarily the boots on the ground, but either facilitate those interactions between people or help them through the planning process, either indirectly or in some cases when we've done comprehensive plans and so on. But again, we are, if you want a quick summary of that, we're an economic development district, we're a regional planning organization, we support the counties, and in that district with a variety of issues, it's just what are they looking to get done for this particular point of time.
Thank you. I have a follow-up there. So it looks like in 2017, this region had about 56,000 people, according to the the graphs here, how many grant writers do you have on staff?
So our staff is 3 persons. It's myself, the executive director. I handle a great deal of the grant writing. If it tends to get into geography, census, economic incentives, then that's Andy Shaw in our office who does the mapping functions and economic development, and then we have an office manager.
Do you contract out at all for assistance with grant writing?
It depends. If we think we can handle it in our house. So, for instance, we did the comprehensive plans that we've done in-house. We've been talking with Joe Davis County and Lee County to do that, and we'd likely do those in-house. For the wayfinding guidebook, because we don't necessarily have illustrators on staff, we hired a consulting firm to get that done through an IDOT grant.
Ms. Bradshaw?
Thank you. Mr. Payette, can you sell us a little bit on your fall summit and for the listening public, talk about the dates and who would want to attend this?
Yeah, so it's hard to plan for a 6-county region, especially when you're inviting municipalities, counties, soil and water, and so on. So we try to broaden to the extent that we can, but there are specific elements covered. I think the one that I want to highlight for this group, even though he's not our prime speaker, although he's good in the sense that he's talking about how you reinvest in your downtown rather than, say, external financial institutions, is Brian Hollenbeck, which he works for the Economic Growth Corporation, and his organization has made a number of investments in the area for multifamily housing. They purchased recently the Campbell Center, the Shimer College in Mount Carroll, 14 acres, 12 buildings, and so on, and are hoping to reinvest in that. We helped them a little bit, actually, with applying for a grant to support some of their technical assistance studies and so on. But I think that might be particularly helpful for Freeport because one of the things that workforce really looks for is housing, and when you don't have a lot of housing that may say whether it's single family or multifamily residential or in places where you need it to be, you need, say, a developer to come in and do that. And I think Brian has a really good sense of how he's been able to make his organization specifically been able to make investments in those areas. So potentially giving you ideas and also potential to network with him and work with him as a developer. And I will say for the other speaker, I think one of the things that our educational systems, this is for the workforce one, we do maybe a good job of putting together programs, but we don't always provide the customer service that's expected or assumed that will be provided to the general public. So one of the things that impresses me with her is that she's able to speak and say, no, this is how a public sector institution really should respond to people that are looking to be trained or coming in for resources that are needed at a community college. So that's my somewhat meandering pitch, but it's a good chance to meet with your neighbors. It's a good chance to eat relatively cheap food, and it's a good chance to hear some speakers that have some national speaking cred.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Chair?
Mr. Mizek, go ahead.
So first of all, the spirit of the Black Hawk Hills Regional Council, I certainly agree with having a regional representation and really having a good voice within the communities in the region. So recognizing some of the challenges, obviously we were looking at many red dots and trends that are very challenging. I'm curious to pick your brain on this a little bit. Have you seen any studies looking at communities, regions that have suffered loss and have come out of that and found some of the keys strategically to head back in the right direction?
Yes, this might be a longer conversation, but sure. I guess sometimes we just go with what's most recently on our head, but I just took a personal trip to Kansas, and they have some amenities that our area don't, but we were trying to guess what the population of the county was, and it was 2,000 people. I mean, the whole county was 2,000 people. But for whatever reason, a number of people have relocated to that area because they've seen opportunity through that distress. So the old schoolhouse, they're trying to repair it. They're doing it slowly over time. They've got a building that used to be a bank at one point, really small building, probably a closet more than anything. But this has attracted, say, artists and so on. And I want to be careful a little bit because I think there's a sense that, oh, you bring artists in and everything's going to be great. That's not necessarily the case. But one of the things I want to point out is sometimes you need to figure out how to view your assets in the ways that people would not normally view them. So a deteriorating house is an okay thing if you have an idea for what you're going to do with it. Sometimes it has to be demolished and taken down. Sometimes it's in the floodplain and it has to go. But there are other areas that you can view things two different ways. That's terrible, or this is an opportunity. Again, I'm not really getting to specific examples, but one I would say is Galena. If somebody had decided at some point in the past that in the 70s or 60s, when Galena had really fallen in on itself and there wasn't a lot of investment, that we should just tear it all down, you would not have what you have today. So somebody took it upon themselves, whether it was governmental, individual stakeholders, and so on, to whether it's historically preserve or start a business improvement in district. But they made use of things that were already there. Could they save everything? No. So maybe that can be summed up as the attitude with respect to how things work. There's a lot of small, I think, examples of how things are working in even communities down here. People have been to LeClaire, people have been to Dubuque and seen their kind of renaissance. Again, they have different assets, so it's sometimes hard to make the direct comparisons. But I think there are ready examples, and some of those are all the more apparent when you start to read through their planning documents and what do they do, whether they did them in-house or hired a consultant. You might check out the American Planning Association. They give an award every year for comprehensive plans and downtown plans. And again, some of these you're going to look at and what does Honolulu or what does Hawaii have to do with what's going on here. But there's a lot more similarities to the types of civic actions or private investments that are made in an area that I think you can replicate locally, even though it comes from an exotic place. So I'm not sure I exactly provided as many specific examples as you might like to chomp down on, but I can certainly think about that and send you some more when we get out of this meeting. So.
Very good, thank you.
You mentioned that there were 3 members from each county on the board for the council.
Yes.
Do you know off the top of your head which 3 members of the Stevenson County board are on the?
So the representative from Stevens County Board is Sam Newton. So he's the specific appointment by the board there. We just had a new appointment, which is done jointly with the county and the Soil and Water, and that is Tim Wilson. He lives up in the Dakota area, firefighter, works for, I think, a business now in the Rockford area. And then Seth Wenzel is the Soil and Water Conservation District representative.
Thanks. Well, again, we thank you for your presentation. Any other questions or comments for Mr. Pyatt? All right, well, thank you, sir.
Thanks for the opportunity.
All right, we'll move on to item number 8, which is the presentation of the draft of strategic plan by Eric Dregney. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong, Eric.
You nailed it.
All right. So thanks again for more of your time tonight in planning. I think you heard in the last presentation, planning matters, and the way Galena went from being broken in the 60s and 70s to relatively fixed now was through the leadership of a mayor. His last name is Einsweiler, and in the 80s he led the charge to save all those buildings in their downtown. So downtown streetscape improvement and rehab turned into what Galena has today, and they made a choice to pick a vision and have a direction. So that's what's kind of interesting about what you guys are doing, what you've been doing over the last 2 or 3 years through the leadership of your mayor and the council that you've had. So thanks for the chance to be a part of that with you all. What I thought I'd do is hit the highlights, and we're not going to read this out loud to each other. We've all had a chance to review it numerous times. You've all had a chance to review this in person and electronically. So I want to hit the highlights and get quickly to any comments you have on the draft as you have it in front of you today, so that we can capture those and make any changes. And then I want to jump to the indicators conversation, where I've provided you some examples of potential progress indicators that you may want to track and measure as you go forward. So the vision did did take a little bit of a change, mostly in the form of, I'm going to grab my notepad. In case you say something I need to remember. Mostly in the form of just sentence structure. So the content remained the same. I worked with Ms. Bradshaw, or Brashaw, no D, to repair some bad sentence structure that we had in there in our previous draft. So we worked through some of those things. So not a lot of change there. I will take a moment to read this because I think the vision really matters and it sets the tone for the document. Freeport is a destination of choice. So imagine you're standing in Freeport, right, in 2035. This is what you hope you're looking around and seeing then. Freeport is a destination of choice. Our innovative city boasts an entrepreneurial economy with vibrant and safe neighborhoods. Freeport supports an abundance of educational, cultural, and outdoor experiences for all residents, including visitors. Our community is connected, accessible, and welcoming. There are opportunities for growth for all. So that's really where we're trying to head. That's the vision we're setting for the community through this plan. And very similar to the previous plan, this is really aimed at updating the work that you want to do within these. Mission statement, no change. The priorities, as we set up that day, it looks like I've just got a little formatting thing going on there. Connected, accessible, and safe community, diverse and engaged citizens, effective public-private partnerships, premier education, arts and culture, responsive, efficient government, thriving entrepreneurial economy, and vibrant neighborhoods. So these are the areas then that we expand upon, and we talk a little bit about each one and create a little bit of a vision around each one of those. I won't read through this to you all. Again, you've had the chance to review it. If there's one you want to call out when we get to questions, we can skip back to it and talk about those as we go along. So essentially, we just explained what we meant by each of those headings. And this all came out of the discussions that you all had in your two-day off-site session. So let's keep going. This is a key thing, I think, for the community to know, the idea about how does this get implemented? You know, what happens? Great, we have this great little piece of paper, you know, a booklet, and so how does it work? How does it turn into real action? And there's really two parts to this. There's the idea that there's this long-range vision, and we're all aiming towards that, but then there are day-to-day actions that both the council have to take and the city manager and his staff have to take. So when we get a little farther along, we tell exactly how that works. The policy agenda is really the responsibility of the mayor and council, obviously supported by staff and others who may provide input. But at the end of the day, it's the council's job to make sure the things on the policy agenda happen. Those are decisions you have to make around policy or around funding to allow work to go forward. And then the manager agenda is really a responsibility of the manager, his staff, and again, anybody he might bring in to help to make sure these things go forward. So these are the items over the next 3 years that you all decided that you wanted to focus in on, that to-do list, if you will, that you can work through over the next 2 or 3 years and you know, ideally complete. Now, some of these won't be complete in 3 years, but they are the focus of your work over the next 2 or 3 years. At the end, it just talks about how, you know, what was the process for developing the document. So we just really just say what happened. You know, we met during a series of meetings. We had a retreat. It talks about who was involved and, you know, the actual process itself along with who was involved in it. So before we go to indicators, any comments, questions, suggestions around this draft that you'd like me to take back?
Chair.
Mr. McClanathan?
Thank you. And thanks for meeting with us and the various individuals and putting this together. I'd like to, just so the public understands a bit, for those who might have been paying attention, saying, didn't you guys kind of go through a similar process a couple years ago? Yes, we did, and that's what we kind of started from scratch on all that, the short term and the broad term. And then as we got a few years down the road, there was a realization that a lot of the short term work had been accomplished, and it was time to kind of do a little reset, refresh, and say, one, looking at the long term, are there any long term things we need to change? And then two, let's reset on the short term. So that's where this all came from. And again, thanks for your work in putting it together.
You bet.
Chair?
Mr. Misick.
In seeing the presentation from Blackhawk Hills and as well as some of the engagement here, I'm thinking there may be some opportunity to develop even a little bit further in a couple of these areas. When looking at the diverse engaged citizens section, I'm thinking about if we're casting vision for the direction to go, it's overcoming the culture of things where we don't have solutions, and it's actually we look ahead in time, like to 2035, and say, where are we in our mindset and our thinking, and being solution oriented instead of I'm using my voice right now to talk about the thing that's not going well or the issue that we have. It's coming to the table with solutions and investigating things well, and I think that should really be a part of the vision of how we're engaging with citizens and drawing out those best ideas. And I really believe that's the spirit of entrepreneurship that's a part of our vision.
Mr. Chair.
Ms. Brashaw.
Thank you. Mr. Dregny, I want to thank you for helping us put together this vision. Our strategic planning session, I think, is very important for Freeport. As Manager Crow had even said during one of our sessions, one of them that he kind of was taken over on, I was teasing him about that. He was on the same team as I was, and he was directing our team. It helps staff. There again, we have a management agenda set then for 2020 to 2022. And also, we have our policy agenda for some of us. As a council, we have things that we can strive towards, and yet the management teams actually know what they're striving for, too, within the next 2 years after 2019. So in my opinion, I think it's very important to do these strategic visions, goals, and planning every couple of years, so we have that path to follow, and the public then also knows what we are attempting to strive. So I thank you for your directorship with all of this and helping bring us all together and being the glue that kind of molded the group and some of the ideas together, even though I was a little bit critical of some of the way it was written down on paper. I also appreciate you being patient with me as we hammered out some of those little details that were important to me, and without changing the vision of the whole group.
Yeah.
So thank you again.
You bet. It's a team sport. All right. So let's skip. Do you guys drive this thing? Is that what goes on? Or do I have to switch to the next, or is it just down below? All right. No.
You need to, Kurt.
I can find it if it's on the desktop, maybe. Or maybe not. Oh, here it is. Oh, you drive. See, I knew someone else was driving. All right. Thanks. All right, so it's kind of two-part conversation that we had over the past few meetings. The first was the idea that we wanted a plan, and then the second was the idea that we wanted to be able to measure what happened. And we introduced a format called results-based accountability, where we identify the results that we want to have. In this case, we linked our results with the strategic goals. And then we identify indicators that might tell us if we're on the right track. And these are meant to be examples. So these are things that you could certainly use. They're examples that make sense. So I tried to have examples that make sense. So you could just take them and use them. But I also think you may want to add on to some of them based on data you know you have, or specific measurables that you know you have that I might not be aware of. So we'll just use this first area to kind of get into the groove here. So The policy and management agenda items, I had corrected agenda, but we didn't catch that. The policy and management agenda items are mixed together as you go through in this case, in this format. So connected, accessible, and safe community, two broad indicators at a community level that you could measure would be things like crime rates, things like road, sidewalk conditions, right, in terms of being accessible or safe, just as two ideas. There may be things that you find more valuable at, again, that really high-level, community-level indicator to measure, but those are the kinds of things you could measure. And then the specific strategies that we developed in the planning session that fall under this category are the continued funding for safety initiatives, and the performance measure for that would be the amount of funding secured. Policy safe, and you could identify more, right? So there might be more things around continued funding. It might be partnerships you write. It might be grants you pursue. There are a lot of performance measures that would fall under that. Public safety department structure and assets review. Again, this one happens to be a management agenda item. So is it done? Did we do it? Was the review completed? And again, there could be other performance measures that come out of that. Things that you decided to change or adopt would be other performance measures that would be worth noting and calling out, so you know that you made progress on that particular item. Tree removal program. You know, we talked about the number of trees there were, so the percent of trees that need to be removed. It could be the number there are, the number that were removed. You may even have a, gosh, we don't want to just take down all the trees, we want to put up new trees in the process of that, right? So it could be a strategy and a performance measure around actually tree replacement versus tree removal. So those are little nuances that you all can take as you move through the work of actually implementing the plan. But that's the idea of how those work. So any questions on just the approach? Does it make sense when you look at the first example? I just want to make sure we're all following before we kind of tick through these. So you've got results. I should show you at the bottom of, and you all have them in front of you, I know. But at the bottom, I've got the little key. So R is result, indicator is, or I rather is indicator, S is strategy, and P is performance measure. And we just did that first one there. So then your second strategic focus area was diverse and engaged citizens. So one way to measure diversity is obviously through population demographics. A way to measure engagement would be participation with government. You might have other engagement measures that you identify and you want to utilize. Those are just two really high, broad level ones. And we actually talked about how do we have, you know, more participation in government. So that's why that one came to mind. In the individual strategies and performance measures, you've got a management agenda item around census counts. I threw in, you know, the conversation we had around Neighborhood Watch just as an idea where you can add to this in the future. So again, these are examples where as you start to develop a dashboard that you want to look at on a quarterly or biannual basis to see progress on the work that you indicated you want to do in your plan, this is an example of how those things could work. And I don't think staff would have any problem identifying the data that goes along with most of these things. I'll just skip down to the next one here. So effective public-private partnerships. That could be identified through projects you're doing collaboratively. It could be even things like new construction dollars. Maybe you're attracting in funding for road repair. Maybe you're attracting in funding for, you know, other public-private type projects, and you want to measure those dollars right along with the number of projects and things like that. So those are those high-level indicators. Again, they're usually pretty broad as you think about how they work. On the strategy side, you had an effective land use policy that you wanted to make sure you updated. So having that done is the performance measure. Strengthening and building accountable regional economic development partnerships. Again, projects completed together, but again, you could even identify things that you're doing with those partnerships and create performance measures around them. So you could say, hey, we want to attract 3 grants together with the Blackhawk group you just heard from, or some other group that you're partnering with, and those could be performance measures. You could measure the fact that you either did them or you didn't, and how many dollars did you bring in, and what does that look like. So you can see quickly by using this approach, you can start to really tell the story about what happened because you wrote this plan. You can go back and really see it live as it happens. You can track it as it goes, and you can call out the key data points that you want to and tell the story behind that data. Premier education, arts and culture, at a high level, are there more art venues? Are there more things related to arts and culture going on? Are citizens participating in them? So it's one thing to have more of them, but if nobody goes, that's not that interesting. So, how much are there more venues? How well is anybody going? Is anybody better off? Did it create an economic or cultural impact in your community? Your strategy there, as an example, could be, again, having that policy that we talked about that you want to have in place about how does the city play a role in this and really helping the community know what you will and maybe won't do as it relates to the arts. So that's the idea behind the policy there and getting that done. You had a lot in this space because you guys care about being a responsive, efficient government, which is good. I'm gonna make it just a tick smaller because I think it'll fit then. So high level, you could measure, what are citizens saying? Do they think you're responsive and efficient? You could measure things around response times, and that's not just how fast a police or fire engine shows up, but how long does it take to get a building permit through from the time somebody requests it to the time they get it back, right? So there's a lot of things people ask you for as a city government, and your response time matters. That might be a way to think about how efficient and responsive you are. Balanced budget. You talked about the fact that you balanced the budget, and I think that speaks highly to efficiency. So how are you doing as it relates to that? Those are high-level indicators around that result. Specific strategies you have, communication and engagement plan, that's something you want to complete, and I think you would want to measure whether citizens actually helped you make that engagement plan and how that worked. The comp plan is underway. Again, are people participating and helping you shape it? That speaks to responsiveness along with efficiency. Zoning map, same idea. Integrated capital improvement plan, really same idea. Are you implementing those things, and what do they look like? And when I say implementation milestones, I don't think that would actually be the performance measure. I think you'd identify the specific milestones that you want to implement in the capital plan and name them out. So there might be half a dozen performance measures under that one strategy as an example. Thriving entrepreneurial economy. So you could measure things as big as what's the Freeport GDP. You could measure revenue sources. So there's a lot of ways to look at the economy. You can measure unemployment rates. There's plenty of indicators at that community level that you can use here. These are just examples again. But we also had strategies that we know we wanted to implement to make sure that the economy actually thrives. So we know a new fiber network can make a huge impact. When I was struck by the presentation from the Blackhawk Council, when you were looking at those job growth categories, there wasn't a tech bar. I live in the region too, so anywhere in our region there was no tech bar growing. This could matter, right? If you want to talk about how do you bring some whole new sector to our community, I think fiber might be one path. Transportation improvements, right? So there's your performance measures. And again, not just the study got done, but did citizens participate? Or were any policies adopted or changed based on the study? So you can really talk about the fact, anyone can do a study and put it on a shelf. How you did it and what happened afterwards are certainly performance measures you'd want to think about including as you develop these kinds of dashboards. Water sewer, you guys are doing great work there, and you could be measuring those and really telling the story of, who's water line got improved and how many miles and those kinds of things. Vibrant Neighborhoods was a new, not really a new, but we separated it out, right? So if you look at the previous plan to this plan, we separated out Vibrant Neighborhoods into its own category and really felt, I think the group really felt like it was worth looking at on its own. And when I started looking at where the strategies fell, a large number of the strategies you developed actually fell under this category, so it made a lot of sense to separate it out. So things like EAV and even citizens, what do they think of their own neighborhood? And you know, I share experiences from Dubuque where I do a lot of work, and there were a fair number of studies done in Dubuque over the last 10 years about how people felt about going downtown. They're trying to develop their downtown, and it turns out people were afraid to go downtown in Dubuque, especially after, you know, dark. And so that's, you know, that's a citizen rating of a neighborhood, right? That's what I mean when I say that. Where do citizens think they want to live? What do they think of their own neighborhood? Those might be interesting points to help you think about how to invest in your community. Here's a series of strategies from kind of technocrat ward and zoning map, right? That those things need to be done, to bike path expansion, the continuation of the demolition blight reduction initiative, the continuation of the pre-disaster mitigation program, streamlining code enforcement, streetscape improvements. So some of these are continuations from the previous plan, but what we're adding here is ways, again, that you can measure your progress and better tell the story to the community about what you're doing as it relates to these strategies and how you're spending the dollars and what the community is actually getting for them. That's the big idea behind this dashboard. So one is accountability for yourselves to be able to look at it and say, yeah, we actually are doing something here. Look at these performance measures that are telling us we're succeeding or not. Maybe we need a little more effort in this area. We haven't done much. Or on the other hand, to tell the story out to the community and say, you know what, in the last 3 years we've adopted this plan and here's what we've accomplished, here's how we've used your dollars, and here's the impact it's having, and we have the data to show it. So that's the idea behind these examples. I'd be curious about any comments you have on these. These will not, you know, be put into the plan. They're really a tool that I can work further with Lowell and his team to put into a dashboard of sorts. They could do it themselves, frankly, but I'd be happy to provide any assistance needed to move that part of the initiative forward.
Well, thank you, Eric. I think you're right. This is a tool, and it may seem to those watching at home might be a little unaware or unfamiliar with this process, but it's a tool that the staff will be able to use to basically hold ourselves accountable, guide us in the right direction, and allow others to see, you know, the progress we're making or the areas we need to improve in. So this was very helpful. So was the sessions we had prior to this. So I thank you for your time, and I'll open it up to council with any questions or comments. And without any, thank you, Eric, for your time. And as always, we appreciate what you do.
Thank you.
All right, we'll move on to item number 9, which is the brief and overview of the complete budget that's presented by Director Bucus and Manager Crow.
Hey, thank you, Chairman Boardman. We're going to, I'm gonna let Kurt bring it up here. So, all right. So, this was, as you know, that we've changed the budget year to that our new budget year starts 1 January. This was a lot of work. So for Randy and the whole and his staff, Michelle and Tommy and Randy, as well as all of the staff members here. We were in the process of doing both our audit as well as we're putting to the staff. I think this may be, this is this budget you have in front of you, and each one of you have a copy of it. There are a few changes we're going to be made. This was printed off for Friday's budget. We've gotten some updated investment numbers on the budget for the pensions as we go forward, so those will be updated. But this is an opportunity. This is going to be a brief overview so that we can, then you'll have 2 weeks to look at this. This is a little bit different. We're doing it different this year. You have 2 weeks to look at it, and then we'll come back on the 28th and start going more in details over questions that you may have. So we'll start with the general fund. You'll see we have a slight revenue. We have a slight extra surplus. It's $24,000 in the general fund from our anticipated revenue. Now, the one thing I will comment about this, the revenue, we have not put any of the cannabis money in this because we were advised by the state we have no idea what the cannabis money is going to be. So, and how much that's going to be played into it. That's both the revenue if we get a dispensary as well as a revenue that the state's going to give us. There are some additional training things we're going to have to do. Chief Summers is still trying to get his hands around of all the training coming that they're recommending going forward for our police officers in dealing with that. So, as you can see, again, fire and police and streets are major, in the general fund, are major expenditures. We'll go more detail, and I'm sorry for the eye chart. We're going to break this down, but this is the police, and if you, and as always, the big part of these budgets are personnel. So you're talking about personnel items directly cleared up to workmen, Social Security, IMRF, and police pension, Medicare. You'll see basically from, Randy, I'm going to borrow your pointer. So you'll notice that basically from here up is personnel cost. That's all based upon the size of the staff. So it gets you a good feel for how much of our budget is dealt in personnel. And the same thing will be true in fire. This is the remainder of it. See, you need to really compare it. You go back to the 2018 budget, which is your first line, compare it to those two lines. That was what our actual was in that time frame. So this is what our expenditures that we have going forward. This is our gap, basically our 8-month period. So it has gone up as expenditures have gone up. Healthcare has dropped down. We actually are, being a member of IVBC, city as a whole, healthcare expenditures have gone down.
Chair? Thanks. I don't want to, tonight, like you said, we'll have a couple weeks to review this and then really, dig into it. But from a higher view level, it looks like that, when I was looking at the police, it looks like the vast majority of the increase year over year is due to the additional funding of the pensions. Would that be an accurate statement?
That is accurate. That's okay. A very accurate statement. And as we know, we have this year we've added in a new revenue source into the pensions to pay both fire and police pensions.
Yeah.
So this is the fire budget. Again, Medicare and above, that's in the pensions. So you see the expenditures. What's interesting, I'll point it out since Peter pointed out, is that look at the fire pension contribution versus the actual salary that we're paying. It kind of gives you an idea of what the expenditures are. And again, look out here. The big increase you'll see in fire pension and I'll remind the council, for those of the members that weren't here, I know we have 4 new members. We had 14 people retire in the last 2 years. And that's approximately right, Mike. Yeah. So that's really driven our pensions. It's gotten them younger too, but. Streets, you'll see the Medicare and above, PEP contributions above, it's personnel, and then contracted vehicle and repair maintenance. That's dealing with, as we're going, the fixed cost. For some of that is the cost that we have for enterprise. There, we run the fleet maintenance on program under Public Works and Streets, but that's also additional vehicles that we have to do. The big trucks, as we had talked about, that fleet is getting older and older, and we're spending more and more money on that. Snow removal, our favorite topic. So the good news for council is, Dennis, what was the bid come in at? $72.15 for salt this year, which is significantly lower than what we paid last year. We just got the state salt bid, so we should be seeing our barns start filling. All right. Questions? All right. TIF and pensions. This kind of gives you the idea of what the TIF. Now, so one of the things you'll see is the expenditures on the TIF. We have a huge reserve in Lamb Road TIF. So Randy and I talked about, we made a decision to start drawing this account down. Plus, we have expenditures that are going out to TriStar Metals. We have another developmental agreement. We've put Greater Freeport Partnership in this area, a lot of that into that area. Downtown TIF expenditures are dropping down there and are lower than revenue, or actually they're staying pretty consistent, but it's lower than anticipated revenue, which are our 2 big TIFs. We are seeing West Avenue go up. And the good news was we had somebody pull a permit for a $1.4 million permit down in the Lamb Road TIF area today. So,
Chair,
Mr. McClanathan?
will we have a further breakdown in regards to the
Yes.
TIFs expenditures? Okay.
okay, and I just want to put the oversight. The TIF expenditures are actually in your budget, the breakdown of them.
Great, thank you.
I mean, we're going to break these down further. So this is, again, just the highlights. This is the overall revenue versus expenditures. As we go out, we have to, as we go through expenditures, we have to build up a little bit of extra money as we go out there, and as the work we're going forward for replacement and work we have in water and sewer. And storm, you see that's with the new money that we're getting into storm. We're starting to big expenditure going back to the capital plan, as we had $120,000 for the study, and then that'll start getting us money for doing those first 10 small projects that we have out there.
Manager, with regards, if you look at that, looks like there's a lot more money going in and also going out in 2020 than it was last year. Is that 2019 budget only that 8-month?
That's that only 8-month budget.
Thank you.
You'll see it more in detail here, comparatively. So, it's gone up some. If you look at the 18 budget, it's gone up some, but for water. But you got to remember that revenue, and what we're doing with that is we're building we're drilling a new well, we're building a new water treatment facility. We have several lines that we're putting in throughout the city. Remember back from the capital plan, this is that year, this coming up year is really when we start going into high gear on the work in the water department. And this is some more expenditures for water department. Okay. Yeah, this is, so that's comparatively what the expenditures were in 18, which is our last full year, versus this. So sewer revenue, see, it's gone up. It actually is, it's staying pretty consistent as we're going forward. The majority of our increases on capital, all that were on the, and water rates were on the water side, less on the sewer side.
Chair?
Mr. Misick?
So question on the previous slide as we were looking at water expenses, so forth. It's a curiosity here on, as we have incidentals, we have a water main breaks and so forth, and we're responding to those. How are we tracking against budget, like within 2019, and how are we addressing that into 2020?
So we get back, we get bills as they track, so the guys get overtime. We buy parts as we need them. That's part of our O&M, which is part of the water money, the expenditures. If they go out there and work, we also put equipment. We have to contract outside services. If we go, what's your depth requirement? We don't go below 12 feet, right?
Yeah, 12, 13 feet.
We have to go deeper than that. We have to contract that out. And we use Fisher to go do the underground, Fisher or Civil to do the underground work. So.
Follow up?
Go ahead.
So as we're looking at these expenses as they're tracking, the reason I bring this up is it's known that these are unknown entities, right? We don't know, we can't predict when the next water main break happens, and it's just making sure we are setting aside enough funds to address that as proactively as we can. And so it's looking at how we've been tracking, if there are trends, and if we need to make adjustments there.
So if you remember back, the trends also, so what we do is in our capital plan, we look at the trends in dealing with the water mains that we are breaking, and we adjust things. We brought Santa Fe forward to this year budget, but we also are looking, so that drives our capital plan into the water main that we're replacing. And then we also do track what our water main breaks are, and that's actually how we develop the budget as we go forward.
Thank you.
And the big difference is so you understand, the capital plan is done by sources outside the city, contracting sources, where O&M is done internal, for the most part. There are exceptions. And O&M is operation and maintenance. So see, as we said, we've been running a deficit in this transfer. That's transfer from water, correct, Randy? Yes. Yeah, that's a transfer. Since these are considered business-like activities. So business-like activities, water, sewer, storm sewer, are those activities which generate revenue for the city. And so these funds can transfer. We cannot We cannot take money from these funds and transfer them in the general fund, and similarly, we cannot take general fund money and transfer them into this fund. It has to be a loan back and forth. So, you know, like one of the things you talked about, sludge maintenance management, that's one of the things we do on a regular basis, maintenance. We just approved that contract out. That actually lowered our cost, which is good. The other thing that we've done across the city, I mean, these are small things, but just to give you an idea, so we've centralized the purchase of IT equipment under one department. We've centralized the contracting for office supplies, and now those are centrally managed so that each department's not buying their own material. And fuel and gas is all managed under Public Works. So we'll continue on. All right. Storm, this is a big jump for us in revenue. And so we were not, up until the council made the decision to move forward, we were not at the point where we did not have enough money to fix the problems. We were just having enough money to maintain the storm. We were paying for one individual and the money. Now we have the ability to do some capital improvements. Library. I know Ashley's back here. So while she is a department head of the city, she also has her own taxing that has to be approved by. She's probably the toughest department head of the city because she has to get her board to approve her budget, followed by city council to approve her budget. And the same thing with her taxing. So this is her revenue from her line item. The other thing is, if we are not using personal property replacement tax for pensions, which that's going into pensions right now, by city ordinance and state law, the remainder has to go to the library. And unfortunately, last year she did not get any of that. I'm sorry about that. That is hard to read. One of the things we've been talking about with the library is see if we can consolidate some of our maintenance. So all of our buildings are maintained, with the exception of the library, under our own contracts. The other thing that's interesting about the library is because the library board's a separate entity, they have a separate line item for legal services. But we do provide the financial and human resources for them. And their contract, their workers are AFSCME, the union workers. More library expenses, I guess I should have. And Ashley has done a very good job at really understanding where she falls with the other and trying to maintain her expenses while improving her services. Grants. So we've got the IDNR flood. We'll have to add this one in here because we just got the approval for 740, what? Yeah, 700, what was it? 764,000 for IDNR round 2. The big jump on that, as we talked about, was because HB Plastics had to abandon their building after the last flood. And those properties were brought in after the March flood. into it, so we'll add those in there. So the big thing is that land bank, one thing with the understanding with the land bank grant is now, because we're with Region 1 Planning Council with the land bank, talk about those other partners. The state directed us to join Region 1. It was interesting, you talk about Black Hawk Hills, that's where the split is between the city and the county. The county's still with Black Hawk Hills. We don't do much with Black Hawk Hills because the state directed us to join Region 1 to participate in the land bank. The land bank funds all now come under Region 1 for grant. And what they did was the state, was it this year, they changed the policy that land banks are the only way that we're going to get IDA blight reduction money and purchase money. So that was important as we go forward with that. The other thing is, this is something to think about for next year's budget. See this line item here, DOJ, this is the last year that we're going to get that funding. So we're going to have to absorb that funding line into next year's budget. Not this year coming up, but in fiscal year 21. So that goes into the police budget. The other thing is we'll talk a little bit about it. DOPE, which is the Pretzel City Transit. We are losing money right now on that grant because Burner's no longer paying United Way is transferring that. So we're going to have to take a careful look at that grant. Well, that provides a good service to us. We need to look at how the expenditures on those grants. We're losing about $70,000 a year on that. And that's the maximum now amount of what our match is going to be that you approved, 1.8 million. So.
Mr. Crow,
Yep.
with regards to the DOJ, I assume that's the Office of Violence Against Women grant?
That's correct.
So that goes to the Special Victims Unit that we have at the police department?
Yes.
And also the voice, it's funds parts of Voices?
Parts of Voices, that's correct. So what we're going to have to do is pick up the cost of our officer and the training that she's required to continue to go through.
Would this be available for us to apply for again?
It would be. And we'll be looking for the announcement for the next grant.
Thanks.
Other things that we talked about, we talked about street improvement, our expenditures. So we have the bond money that we went out for that. We had 3 years to spend that money under the regulations. We have a large street improvement program going out. And some of the capital equipment, fire improvements we've talked about on the capital improvement. Healthcare, you see, we're actually at the point now where we are, one of the requirements under IPBC is we have to build a reserve to cover us, and we're building that in there. What you don't see is, because that's the short year, is this figure before we went to IPBC was in the $4 to $4.5 million. So we've gotten it under control with moving to IPBC. Foreign fire, that is required. That's something that is supposed to support the firefighters, just as a drug and forfeiture. It can only be used for items for the firefighter. It's actually, foreign fire, it's actually put together by a panel that's chaired by the fire chief and has union members and non-union. Drug forfeiture can only be used to support items in dealing with the police department, particularly in drug enforcement. And the way the ordinance is written, just as a reminder, the tourism, all the tourism money right now is going to the Greater Freeport Partnership, the way the ordinance. So So total revenue, total expenditures. That looks high. That had to do because we didn't have our pension numbers yet. Randy, what's the new number? Do you have it yet?
Total?
Yeah. We still had a couple things we had to calculate. We had to make some changes. We now have the new total is, so your new revenue.
Our total revenue for all funds for next fiscal year will be $57,953,385. And we're projecting expenditures of $54,862,251.
So we're in the positive. The other thing that is, the other thing we're pulling aside, remember, one of the things the council, just to remind the council, is you passed an ordinance that within within 5 years or 7 years, I can't, that we have to have $3.5 million in reserve, designated reserve, which we didn't have in the past. And we're moving towards that. So some of the surplus will be going into that reserve. So some general fund is balanced, but so you saw the correction. So grant funds, so we have 25% of the DECO funds have been received this year, but they'll be carried over into next year and expended next year. Those are for those. So we have 3 flood funds right now, and those are all for abandoned properties and tax trustee properties. So those are properties that are that are not on the pre-disaster mitigation grant application, and we'll remove a total of about almost 100 properties through those 3 grants. Is that correct? Approximately. Around 100 properties. So, health and environmental fund, even though we raise fees and we're doing everything, we're short $22,000 over what was charged. We're spending down. We talked about the deficit. That's really, we've put more of the funding for the Greater Freeport Partnership in Lamb Road, plus we have to pay out additional fundings as the part of the agreement with TriStar. You have a surplus there. And we can transfer that in to the adjoining TIF areas only. So everybody needs to understand that. That is not money we can use in any other places except for the 2 adjoining TIFs, which are West and Meadows. Thank you. West and Meadows. That's the only place, or Lamb Road. That's the only place that money can be used at. And we have, again, so right now the county tax trustee, the county assessor is projecting we're going to see a 3.4% increase in EAB. On top of that, we're going to see an EAB. Last year's would have gotten an additional $13,000 off of the taxes, off of the properties that we annexed in there. So, and again, we're running all the property tax to the pensions. So,
Chair.
Go ahead.
Thank you. When you say that projection, last year there was a marginal increase, but some of that was in TIF, and so it led to a reduced actual realized amounts. When you say they're projecting 3%, is that across the board, or?
That's taking it into account across the board.
Okay.
So we actually didn't tax, the estimate that we had gotten from him was actually lower than we actually got so the tax rate, we kept our tax amount, but the taxing rate actually decreased last year. So we left some money on the table last year, so.
Or return some to the taxpayers.
Or return to some of the taxpayers, yeah. So, but what we're seeing is the building that we're seeing with the reopening of the Honeywell plant, the building for TriStar, if you don't know, Menards put $1.5 million increase. Walmart was what, $1.2 million increase into their building, and we're seeing other permits pulled. We've seen, we've had, how many housing starts permits have we now pulled? Two this year, two additional ones. We're starting to see that move in the right direction. So, any other questions?
Sure.
Go ahead.
I'm sure we'll have lots of questions within 2 weeks. When will you plan on getting us an updated version that reflects the latest projections that you just got?
We can get those out to you probably by the end of the week.
Okay.
Randy and I we received our audit yesterday afternoon at 4 o'clock, and he and I have been going the draft audit, so we've been going through that. And draft audit looks very good, but we had some questions and concerns that we expressed back to them. So that's what we have to do before that's presented to you at the council meeting. So, but we'll get these out to you. Randy's inputted the numbers. We've got all the final numbers. He got the final numbers for the pensions yesterday as well. So he put those in. And Michelle did a good scrub that looked at revenues, and there were some small changes in the water department. Both, was it just water or water and sewer?
Water, sewer, and general fund.
Okay, small ones. That's why we have Michelle.
What is the timeline going forward?
So we have to have the budget, we'll have the smooth budget. We want to look at it ready, completely ready by the end of November. Has to be on exhibit for examination for 10 days, and then go for approval with the ordinance first week. Because what you do is you read the first reading of the ordinance, last meeting in November, then it sits on open for inspection, and for the 10-day, minimum of 10 days, and I'm getting a head nod from my attorney back there, and then the approval the first week in December. What that allows us to do is then we'll have the first reading of the levy, the first meeting in December, and we'll have a committee of the whole to discuss it, and the second reading in the second meeting in December. The other thing is, first meeting in December, you'll start seeing the budget adjustments we have to make for this year's budget, and for areas that we expended. We always have, right now, the budget is balanced for this year, so you'll see adjustments, but that's because we've had to change the directions where money is and which line items, and then that will be approved on December, the second meeting in December. Is there anything I missed on that, Randy?
No. Mr. McLean, anything? Did you have something?
No, I was just going to say, obviously, it's a lot of information, and I'll reserve any substantive comments we've had a chance to review.
Please look at it in detail. Feel free, give us comments back and or questions, and we'll use the meeting in October to start addressing questions or concerns you may have.
Chair.
Mr. Misick.
So thank you, Manager Crow. Very nice job of hitting the highlights. Just to ask, very general, are there any additional exceptions or opportunities that you see that we haven't yet covered tonight?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yeah, so when we look at this, it's very high level, right? We're trying to understand how all the major pieces fit together. So obviously, when we look at a budget, we're looking at the items we understand well, and also where there are exceptions, unknowns, right, coming into that. And we look also at where there are opportunities, where ways we can cut costs and ways that we can improve efficiencies and so forth. I think we've discussed as a council, camera truck, right? Helps the water sewer to run more efficiently. You know, things like that that actually have a large impact on our budgeting. So are there any of such items on the positive or negative that are impacting us right now?
So the areas that I briefed 2 years ago, for those that were here will remember, this first meeting I gave up here, I told the council we were $1.9 million in the hole. And we had to come out with, over the next 6 weeks, ways to reduce, and that resulted in layoffs, cutting of capital equipment, restructuring the fire department, restructuring public works, all of which we're now seeing the benefits of as we go forward. So I think there are still some restructurings and benefits. That we're going forward and looking at. Personnel, I'm not ready yet to discuss some of those issues.
Sure.
Because we're still working on them from a department head side, and I've had discussions with both the police chief, water and sewer, finance on some things we want to go forward with for the way the structured departments are structured. We're always looking for, the hook trucks, we brought them in last year to improve it. What we're going to do is, one of the things that's in the capital plan is coming up here is the buying of the new leaf vacs, which are higher capacity leaf vacs. We're also looking, if you haven't been on web, we've already put the leaf map up there so people can track it. Eventually, what we're going to do with both the leaf and the snow plowing routes are people will actually be able to track the streets and where they're being done. So that we're continually looking at ways we can improve doing that within the budget and within the means. The big thing we're bringing on over the next 9 months is the new integrated software for finance, which is the council's been waiting for 2 years for us to do that. And that has been a two-year, that was one of the things that took a hit 2 years ago. We cut it off and we moved it. We've gone through an 18-month selection process, and sometime in the next 6 weeks, we will present to you what our proposal is going forward with that. And that will actually integrate all across the line and actually meet some of the requirements that the unions have requested for indication of pay stubs. Bring our pay stubs actually to the 21st century.
Thank you, Manager Crowe.
All right, thank you. Next on the agenda is, we're at number 10, which is the discussion regarding ordinance amending various provisions of Part 12, Planning and Zoning, Title 4, Zoning to provide for adult use cannabis, presented by a handful of attorneys and Manager Crowe.
So I guess I will start with this. This is and I will also have a Community Development Director, Director Zubkoff, because he ran with much help from all of us, the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission made, you looked at this ordinance a month ago. The Planning Commission had the public hearing. I want to thank John. He was the one citizen that showed up for the public hearing. But they made a couple changes in the ordinance. One is you have the new map, moved residential out to 300 feet, took out the group homes, because we have a real problem tracking all of those, because they are not reportable, unlike child care centers. And we take more careful registration on child care centers than we do group homes. So those put in there. We reviewed it. So that was reviewed. Steve, you want to come up and comment make some additional comments on this? And the last comment I'll make before I turn over to Steve is just a reminder to council, the state has already made the decision that we're gonna have the adult cannabis is within the state. That it's gonna be available. All the communities is making a determination whether we're gonna have zoning that will allow a distribution center or some other come in. Even if we don't have a distribution center here in the city, we will have adult cannabis within the city. It's allowed. They can go to Beloit, they can go to Rockford, South Beloit, it's not legal in Wisconsin. South Beloit or Rockford and buy it and bring it back to the city. And they're allowed to transport up to 30 grams. And there has to be a sealed container in the car, but they can be walking across out on the street with a baggie with 30 grams. With that, Steve, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Manager Crow. I believe the highlights of the modifications that were suggested by the Planning Commission are in front of you right now. You've got an amended ordinance which was just passed around that reflects the 300-foot setback for residential. I'll just touch on the difference between what you're looking at tonight and what was circulated previously and what the Planning Commission started with. You'll note that the 300-foot setback, and this is applicable to all cannabis business establishments, so it's not just a dispensary, it's not just a cultivation center. The same setbacks apply to each cannabis business as generally defined. So there's not different setbacks for a dispensary than there are for a cultivation center than there are for a craft grower. So the map that you see in front of you shows where cannabis businesses can go. And that map reflects, I understand, 300 feet from a residentially zoned property. Originally, there was some language about residential use. Well, that becomes very difficult for the city to predict from a planning standpoint. So we can predict where our zoning districts are, but if there's say an upper in a business district or something like that somebody happens to be residing in, that was deemed not to be appropriate, so for a setback. So we just have residential zoning. Also, it's 1,500 feet, as Manager Crow pointed out. It's from schools and daycare facilities. So daycare facilities are licensed by the state. We can look those up. We can know where those are. So we have a defined radius there. The problem with the residential care facilities is if they're under 5 people, they're not licensed by us, and it's very difficult to find that information from the state. It's not on a centralized database or anything like that, so we can have a setback we don't know about, and particularly where we're talking about a large setback of 1,500 feet, that's difficult. You'll also see in what you have tonight, you'll see staff recommendations where there were some blanks before just regarding parking. I think those are pretty straightforward. Some are suggested to be retail, some are suggested to be effectively warehouses and
Andrew, just make sure you're speaking.
Warehouses and also processing facilities was the other one in addition to retail, as you said.
And that's been added to each category as deemed appropriate. I think that's pretty straightforward. I think that's it in terms of the additions. One comment while I've got the mic here. Mr. Hill asked the question, this will tag on to Manager Crow's comment. The state has prescribed 99% of this for us. We're doing citing at this point. They specifically carved out some authority for us through the zoning powers, and they really specified zoning powers and special, even conditional uses, which are special uses. The definition of public place, as Mr. Hill pointed out, is somewhat vague. The answer is yes, but that's what the statute provides, is that personal use is restricted in a public place. In a public place, I don't want to misstate this, it's defined as basically somewhere where you can be observed by others, not including a private residence. So that becomes a very difficult thing. In public places, as we consider them, civically owned properties, City Hall, for instance, would be a public place, streets would be a public place. The question would be whether a business establishment is or is not a public place. The statute does carve out the ability for local municipality to limit or prohibit the on-site consumption of cannabis products in a cannabis business, which is one of the licensed establishments, or any other entity or any other business. So you would have the authority to restrict or otherwise regulate on-site use on a business facility. These are referred to commonly as, well, hookah lounges been thrown around a lot, but or cannabis lounges. So one could consider a cannabis analog to a bar. Now, it's not quite that simple because you have the smoke-free workplace rules, which would prohibit smoking, but would those prohibit the use of edibles on site? You can imagine that becomes somewhat problematic to regulate.
Chair?
Mr. McClanathan.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt you, but before you get
Sure.
too far off of that, going back to the public place question.
Sure.
So you're saying that is language lifted straight from the state statutes and incorporated into here?
Yes, and Attorney Zito actually drafted that portion of it, but I am 99% sure that, I don't have it in front of me, but I'm 99% sure that was lifted directly.
It was just a mirror of what the state statute was.
So let's say, to follow up on that, we were to tweak that provision, it still would be a violation of the state law as it's currently written, correct? So like if we were to if we change our ordinance differently on public place, just a minute, if we were to change it to on public place, you said this was in the state law.
Correct.
Correct? Okay, so is it a statewide prohibition or is it just guidance for municipalities as to what they can or can't do?
So with this, they have limited home rule, from us using our home rule powers. They've basically given us the ability to zone or not to zone areas.
That's my understanding as well. I don't think that we can change the definition of public place. We have the right to set
that's what I'm
what
getting at.
districts we can put it in zoning wise and the such, but
That's what I was getting to. I mean, practically speaking, if we were to even tinker on it, it would have no legal effect, correct?
correct.
All right.
If I could just, Alderman, if I could chime in on that?
Are we gonna have dueling attorney opinions?
No, just supplemental.
Just kidding.
In terms of defining what a public place is, I don't think we can do that. I think
Okay.
that's defined, as Attorney Zito has pointed out, that's defined by the state statute, and I don't think we can monkey with that. The problem is there's a vague area in the statute regarding, so the public place is, again, anywhere when someone can be observed by others. Well, as you can imagine, speaking of doing attorney opinions, you can imagine that this will be challenged. There's a reasonable argument, I believe, that a business, it's hard to call that a public place. Constitutionally, I mean, if you're a private business establishment, it's hard to call that a public place. I think the ordinance leaves open that interpretation. So I think it's a position you could take, but I think you could take the alternate position as well. So what the statute leaves open in terms of local regulation, and I'll just quote it verbatim so I don't get it wrong. A cannabis business establishment or other entity, so that's licensed businesses or anyone else, authorized or permitted by a unit of local government to allow on-site consumption shall not be deemed a public place within the meaning of the Smoke-Free Illinois Act. So now we're pulling in another act. But I believe that does open the door, at least, to defining or restricting the use at a private business. I think that the statutory language leaves that open to the municipality. It's one of the only things, other than the zoning powers, that are left open, is to regulate on-site consumption generally.
And one of the things in the training that Steve and I and Matt went to is they're saying, as we go forward on the business, consumption businesses, they're thinking, because it's not well defined in it, but they believe that the best way to control the Smoke-Free Act, and they realized it, is to only authorize it in freestanding buildings, is what they basically set aside. That's the recommendation, because all the other buildings cannot, if they're under the Smoke-Free Act, if they're anything connected within like a strip mall, it becomes very difficult for them to follow the Smoke-Free Act.
Chair.
Mr. McLean, anything?
So bottom line, this is obviously it's brand new. And it's going to be subject to some interpretation, subject to some court challenges, probably subject to revision by the legislature down the road. Is it your recommendation to leave the language alone for now, and then adjust accordingly as these things develop?
That would be my recommendation, yes, that to leave, not to mess with the definition of what a public place is there. Likewise, there is the initial question, with regards to these consumption lounges, is because that is an area that's carved out, that's left to municipality, you as a municipality can decide, do we want to allow them or do we not want to allow them? So that's the threshold. At that point, then, if you do decide to allow them, then you can have the argument of, well, what's public place or not, but.
And along those lines then, like you were saying with the open air area versus or not, I mean, if we don't do anything right now, are they going to be considered prohibited or permitted?
At this point, from a zoning standpoint, and Attorney Cox, I don't mean to, if I step on your toes, let me know.
Any of you.
There.
Have at it.
So from a zoning standpoint, this particular zoning ordinance and this ordinance does not permit this use, so it's not referenced in here. So therefore, from a zoning standpoint, when you don't specifically allow it, it's not allowed. Getting to one of the subsequent ordinances that we'll be looking at later in the agenda, that kind of deals more so from an enforcement standpoint, that I'd be suggesting if the route that the council wants to go is to say we don't want to allow these, then in that ordinance, that I would, we could craft some language that specifically prohibits then these consumption lounges.
But without permission, it's in zoning. Without being permitted use, it's prohibited at this stage.
Well, yeah, what Attorney Zito, I think, is suggesting, I agree with. Zoning and general offenses code are two different things, right? You've got zoning, which is, I use the phraseology, zoning says, here's what you can do. So the ye mays, right? The general offenses code says what you can't do, okay? And that's thou shalt not. So we have these two different things, and if the here's what you can do doesn't say something specifically, well, you can't have a business which just does that. But the question is, what if you could very easily have something which slips between the categories. So you have a restaurant that serves brownies that just happen to be cannabis infused. Well, that's selling, sorry. But or allow somebody to bring something in or something like that, so they could use something which doesn't fall within the Smoke-Free Workplace Act or whatever. The question from the zoning question is, well, what's the primary use of that building? Is that really a cannabis consumption facility, or is that just an ancillary use? So that's where the general offenses code comes in. General offenses code says you're not going to allow on-site use, or if you are going to allow on-site use, here's the regulation for doing that. So that's where those two, hopefully that makes sense. That's where those two interplay.
It does. I appreciate the explanation. Sorry, can I continue? All right. I appreciate the explanation. Right now, as it currently stands, I don't know. I'd have to go back and check on the general offenses, but it's silent in the general offenses and silent in the zoning. So okay.
Yeah.
So it's technically not allowed, but we don't have something that's addresses it in the general offenses as written.
Correct.
Okay.
And
from a state perspective, why it wasn't addressed in their codes, well, they allow it. They allow it. It was interesting, the discussions, I heard this at both the IML training and at the additional training, is that they did not think that these consumption locations would come into effect until federal law changed. So they left this section to be addressed
once
federal law changes, because the owners of these, they cannot, if they cannot get, they have to have dram insurance. And no one, they felt that no one would issue them dram insurance, and they cannot declare bankruptcy if they have a problem.
Gotcha.
So I have a question. We have, so we are on the zoning ordinance today, or currently. What are we tasked with right now? What's the purpose of the presentation? Or what are you seeking from council?
Excellent question. So what, again, what the state granted the city the authority to do is basically cite the cannabis business establishments. So taking a cue from IML, the model ordinance, working with staff, going through the planning commission, what you have in front of you is an ordinance which establishes that citing through the use of setbacks. So it doesn't establish specific zones where you can do something or not do something. It relies upon proximity to other sensitive business establishments, and that's also one of the suggested avenues through the statute. So the map that you have in front of you lays out what those setbacks are, and then the district specifications, which state which types of business entity, say the craft grower, for instance, can go in ag or M1 through M3. Dispensary can go in B3. Those were all worked through based on what they really are in character and nature. And again, those suggestions, the zoning classifications, where those fall, they're all special uses, so they all go through a special use hearing. There's was some discussion about making them permitted uses, but there's just simply too many considerations, really, for that to be feasible. So what's in front of you is effectively an amendment to the zoning code generally, which provides as a special use in the various districts what's deemed appropriate per staff recommendation in the Planning Commission for each of those districts.
These were all voted on at the Planning Commission, and it was voted 6-0 in favor of these recommendations.
That is correct. The only thing that is there that was not addressed specifically by the Planning Commission is the parking designations, which you have in front of you, and that was just inserted at staff recommendation. And I've reviewed those and would agree with that as well.
And the Planning Commission actually asked for the staff to put those together to forward to you, because we didn't have them in front of us.
Okay, Chair.
Mr. Ross?
Yes, okay, if it comes down to a zoning, who's gonna be the enforcer?
The power that we have through the zoning process really comes down to site location. So in order to get a license through the state, I'm talking in circles, Alderman, I apologize. There's a lot of things. So in order to be issued a license through the state, you have to make an application. And part of that application is proving that you have zoning authority through your local municipality or county or wherever you happen to be located. So in order to obtain that proof, the municipality has to have a zoning ordinance, which is why we're running this through now. But if, say that location was located right in the middle of one of those big red spots on the map, well, at that point, the city would not grant, it wouldn't even have the authority to grant a conditional use permit at that point. So the authority really comes down to, look, we're restricting your ability to cite this business in any of these zones. Beyond that, in terms of the day-to-day operations, we have literally no say. That's all licensed through the state. Unlike gaming and liquor, we don't issue a local license for that. We're expressly forbidden from exercising the licensing authority on these. So really the enforcement of zoning comes down to the issuance of the license in the first place. So it's almost preemptive authority, if you will.
Follow up again. So you have to get the license and everything. So basically, but would that be the police department or the zoning board or the zoning commission?
Be the zoning commission, be the zoning board.
So our police department, here's the interesting thing, is our police department, while they have to have the alarms, they do not do the inspection. inspection is done by the state's police. That's the way I understand it, right, Matt?
Alderman Ross, maybe I misunderstood the question. In terms of enforcing the overall operating restrictions, there's another ordinance which follows on this. So once we get past the citing authority through the zoning power, what I believe is being proposed, which Attorney Zito has presented to you, is that the city can adopt, basically, just like we do with the criminal code, or parts of it, the motor vehicle code, we can adopt what the state has enacted. There doesn't seem to be really anything that prohibits that. So we can enforce through the ordinance violation process or theoretically by fining a business which doesn't comply with the state law. So we do have that authority. Again, I think that would probably be code enforcement.
Okay.
Because really, well, I suppose if a criminal law were violated, that would be PD, but for the most part, what we're looking at is code enforcement.
Okay, thank
Does
you.
that answer the question
Yeah, well,
better?
it's getting better.
Okay. All right. It's better than getting worse.
Mr. McClanathan?
I want to go back to the buffer, the residential care home buffer, where when you initially proposed this, it had the residential care homes in there, and now as proposed, it doesn't. Look, and I understood the logic of the one portion. What did you say? Did you say it was 5 or under 5?
Under
That
5.
we don't know. But however, the ones that are, it's either 5 and above or more than 5, whichever one it is, we actually do know, don't we, which ones those are at?
Yeah, we would know where any new one was. That requires a zoning, it requires a special use permit to get, I think it's 5 or more. So if you have 5 or more, you have to actually come in and get a special use permit. So
this council changed that ordinance was changed here when we passed it. It was since you and I.
I think that was in reference to the returning citizens.
Yeah.
So the existing group homes, say for learning disabled, that sort of thing, that there could be, I suppose, something out there which is grandfathered in, has been there forever. I'm not aware of any. And certainly anybody coming in seeking to cite one would require a conditional use permit.
But, follow-up, Chair.
Go ahead.
But right now, the ones that are 5+, or whatever, the 5+ or over 5, we know where they are, correct?
We don't license them.
Right, because you've got, the only main difference I can see on your maps, most of the ones that you had marked on here on our first map were already overlapped by residential, with one large glaring exception, and that's right at the south end of town. I think it's Willow Glen, probably.
That was actually a mistake on the map. So the big red spot that was in the south of town, I know exactly, I don't have the map in front of me, but I know exactly what you're talking about. Willow Glen and Malcolm Eaton are both out there, but neither of them are deemed residential care facilities under our ordinance. That's a group home. A residential care facility, as our ordinance defines it, is a group home. So those are, day treatment, or, they're not daycare facilities either. They're not defined as that. That's for child care. So they're workshops, basically.
Okay, and what was the rationale in regards to, the statute doesn't address them either way?
No.
The state statute I'm talking about.
Correct. I think that actually, it does not address residential care facilities in the way that we define them.
Okay.
It talks about, I can give you a chapter and verse here if you want.
No, if it doesn't address it, that's okay.
It gives suggestions in terms of setbacks from sensitive locations. Oops. Yeah, locations that deem sensitive, including colleges and universities. And that's it. That's actually all it calls out through the use of conditional use permits. So it doesn't, so the language that was included previously was really IML's standard language. 'Cause that was the stock ordinance that we circulated.
Additional follow-up.
Follow-up.
All right, I understand the operation of Malcolm Eaton, but talk to me a little bit about the operation of Willow Glen. Is that a place where individuals are residing, or just coming during the day, doing
Yes.
tasks? Which one is it?
It's coming during the day. To my knowledge, there's no residential component at Willow Glen.
We talking about the one south of town?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, when we toured the facility, they don't have any permanent staff on, at least when you and I toured it with the police chief.
Yeah, there's no overnight accommodations.
Well, all right, where I'm going is I just want to make sure that if we've got something that it's certain residents that are residing there on a basis, we want to treat them in a similar manner that we're treating the rest of the residential, at least for protecting. So that's why I wanted to get to the difference there. So what you're saying is on that first map that the southernmost red circle around the blue square should not have been on the map under the way that it's currently defined.
Even as it was defined
As originally
previously.
defined.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so that was just a misnomer.
Okay, all right, I appreciate the clarification, thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Go ahead.
Attorney Cox, back to the map here, just looking at it. It appears there's a child care facility that sits just on the other, looks like on the other side of the road from city borders. Underneath, kind of going back to earlier discussions with our annexing, they have to follow the rules so many miles outside the city limits. Should we be including that in our protection of that facility from our zoning inside the city?
That's a great question. One of the things that could happen here, again, with a 1,500-foot setback, that's a big circle, right? You can see the size of those circles on the map. So theoretically, a facility could be sited outside of the city borders, which could be interpreted as creating a setback within city borders. So in order to avoid that happening, what you could do is limit the language in the ordinance as presented, which states any of these facilities which is located within city boundaries. There's good and there's bad in that. You could wind up with a dispensary or a production facility located right next to an entity that would be protected in the city but happens to be in the county. But on the flip side, the city really doesn't have zoning powers outside of its borders. Our county has exercised its zoning powers, so we have limited authority there. We can show up and object. We have standing as a neighbor to object, but that's really about it. And we have some authority within, should we choose to exercise it over the subdivision regulations, but that's.
But it has to be included within our comprehensive plan as we're going forward. The old comprehensive plan did not.
Correct.
And the new comprehensive plan will.
But again, that's just a subdivision regulation, so it really, these types of sensitive facilities really aren't going to be prohibited. There's special uses almost everywhere. You start talking about schools and things, and those are typically special uses everywhere.
Mr. McClanathan, you had a question?
What were you talking about when the comprehensive plan and the subdivision or the residential, you said, is that the 1.5 mile language
Yes.
that you're talking about? Okay.
Yep.
Chair.
Go ahead.
Follow up on that. Are we taking the steps that we need to ensure that we have the option to enforce that if needed?
We are. In the comprehensive plan, as we're drafting it, that's been a discussion that we've had with our consultant going forward.
Thank you.
Mr. Cox, so as this ordinance is written, our zoning would allow for all of these different facilities, including even what you described, hookah bars, but to get them, they would have to go through a process and to get the license for that?
That statement is correct in all but one respect, and that is the hookah bars. So that is under the zoning power not authorized. So since it's not authorized, you theoretically couldn't cite one there. So my concern that I expressed in response to Mr. Alderperson McClanathan's question was that you would have some sort of mixed-use facility where you would allow on-site consumption in a restaurant or something else which wasn't a hookah bar. So zoning doesn't specifically provide that as a type of cannabis business establishment.
Sure.
Go ahead.
How do we clarify? That scenario you're talking about, where it's a restaurant, how do we make a bright line one way or the other?
Well, I think back to what Attorney Zito suggested earlier, zoning doesn't allow it. So if you're strictly a hookah bar and you're going to try to provide on-site consumption, that's a primary use. That's a thing as far as zoning is concerned. It's a use. So that's not allowed. Yeah, we don't allow it anywhere. It's not found anywhere under the zoning code. So you can't do that. The way you prohibit the mixed use is go back to the general offenses code and say that you will not provide for on-site consumption anywhere, or you will not provide for on-site consumption anywhere except subject to these rules and regulations. So you either elect to regulate the on-site consumption, because again, that door's been opened under the statute, or prohibit it.
Follow up?
Yeah.
So, for instance, like we see right now, like the CBD, oil. This isn't the perfect example, but let's, for argument's sake, let's say that it's not a proper zoning in regards to that, and I know that's not the case. But let's say it's not proper zoning, because you're seeing it obviously all over, right now, and what I call is mixed use. I mean, you've got like a video store promoting CBD oil. Right. So, taking this as it is here right now, I'll say like edibles or on-site consumption of things. We'll just leave it at on-site consumption. What you're telling us is right now, if we pass this as presented under all of these, this one and then the ones we're going to talk about next, as presented, somebody can't open up a store primarily or only promoting this. However, arguably, they could have that as part of their regular use, I'll say a gas station or something like that, if it's not prohibited in the general fences?
Is the question as to on-site use?
Yes.
The answer to that is somewhat complex, but I think it boils down to maybe. So and it depends. Remember, it's highly regulated by state law. So to the extent it is truly a public place, probably not. And as you can imagine, that line, back to Mr. Hill's comment that it's a fuzzy definition, gets into those sliding scales. So a gas station, is that a public place? Probably not. But it's probably more of a public place than a restaurant or something else where there's a little bit more of an intimate seating. I don't know. It's unclear. So the point is, since it's unclear, let's address it as such and just try to put a finer point on it, because we can do that. In answer to the question about the CBD places, those are retailers, right? And arguably, without zoning regulation, I think this is an important point, without zoning regulation specifically addressing these, I think they're retailers. I mean, you've got a retailer, and if you're a production or a grower, you're agricultural under local zoning. Now, again, highly regulated at the state level, you fall under all the requirements, but without our zoning, you fall under the broader classifications.
Continuing permission to follow up.
Thanks. Could you between now and our next meeting, get us the list as to where you think these holes are that we need to either cover or not cover, whether we're talking general fences or not?
And I think that from a zoning standpoint, that's where it gets gray. I think handling it in the general fence section, then as a belt and suspenders, that's where it becomes more bright line. So the holes get filled in by adding a provision to the general fence ordinance that says you can't have on-site consumption in a public place, or wherever it is. So, for example, from a zoning standpoint, you could have a restaurant, right? And it'll get gray if the restaurant says, I'm a restaurant, I'm Applebee's or whatever. But all of a sudden you see an ad for Applebee's that says, bring your own dessert, bring your own brownie, whatever. Well, the zoning was for a restaurant.
Right.
But all of a sudden now it's got this weird gray area. But if you supplement that belt and suspenders with the offense ordinance that says there's no on-site consumption, you got to consume it in your house or wherever, some private place, that takes care of it. That fills in the gap that zoning might not, just by the nature that it's zoning, can't address it in a perfect scenario.
And outside of on-site consumption, have you guys come across any other areas that you think we might need to address one way or the other?
That's literally about all we can address.
Okay.
That's where the doors open, is the on-site consumption.
In fact, what they said what they told us is the definition of residence
Sure.
is, they have left it open, and they've actually asked the 3 sponsors of the bill, and all 3 of them gave a different answer.
Yeah, is it the edge of your property? Is it inside your house? I mean, yeah, I can see that.
Right. Okay, Chair, I got one more question.
Go ahead.
Okay, Attorney Cox, okay, have they defined public place? Now, does it define, have they defined that?
Steve, I have it here. The definition of public place. So public place means any place where a person could reasonably be expected to be observed by others. Public place includes all parts of buildings owned in whole or in part or leased by the state or a unit of local government. Public places does not include a private residence unless the private residence is used to provide licensed child care, foster care, or other similar social service care on the premises. So again, it's very broad in the sense that it is any place where a person could reasonably be expected to be observed by others. So there was this discussion at a lot of the seminars is going back to your home. Well, if you're standing in your front yard smoking marijuana, it's the front yard. If it butts the street, could you reasonably be expected to be observed by others there? Make it a slight tangent. How about your backyard? Are you still reasonably expected to be seen by somebody in the public? Maybe less compared to the front yard because there's not a street there, but you still have your neighbors in your backyard that could possibly see you. Okay, let's take it a step further. But what if I have a fence in my backyard? So, these are all things that are going to be questions that will probably be dealt with over the course of the next few years and tweaks by the General Assembly to the state statute. But as of right now, there's shades of gray.
It's open.
And I think it's important.
Rag on the General Assembly, but I won't.
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to tag on to Attorney Zito's comments as well. There's very likely that there's a trailer bill following very soon to address some of these issues, probably in the veto session, which starts end of this month, actually.
That's what IML and the Chiefs Association are partnering to try and get this trailer bill passed in the veto session, because they've realized through all these seminars and meetings that there are holes within this ordinance. But the thing is they've already, Speaker Madigan's already cut 3 days off the veto session.
Is there an urgency or a timeline for us to get this before council voted on and passed?
Excellent question. Yeah, on the zoning piece, yes. If the council decides to allow cannabis businesses of any type within the boundaries, there are going to be ordinance or licenses which are going to start being issued as soon as January 1. And in order,
the bidding's going on right now.
And that's on the early issue or whatever licenses if you've already got a medical dispensary. But you have to have part of that siting requirement for those businesses to locate in Freeport would be to have zoning. So back to Alderman Ross's question, what authority do we have? They have to show that we have adopted zoning and that they are cited properly within our zoning. So
the Illinois City and Community Management Association is tracking communities, and currently there are 38 communities that have adopted and 42 that have opted out. And there are something along the lines of 100 communities that are currently in the same process we're at right now.
Go ahead, Ms. Brescia.
Thank you. Council, one of my questions the other night was regarding multiplexes. As you know, in Freeport we have many, many apartment buildings, and most of them have recycled air. So it brings to the question, if somebody was smoking cannabis in an apartment, they then could contaminate the air for other units, including air that children breathe. So my question was, landlords, can they restrict this use? And I was told, because it is still against federal law, that yes, they can restrict it, and or they can do non-smoking. I guess my question is, should this be disallowed for all apartment buildings because of recycled air structure? Even duplexes in Freeport, we have so many of them. I have a rental map in my desk here, and we have multiples. So it is something too that should be addressed. If I had small children and I was living in a duplex and we had Mr. Smith lived upstairs and he was smoking cannabis, I wouldn't want my children breathing that same air.
So what the state law does allow is for the landlords to establish what they want to do within your lease as you go forward, whether you will allow the smoking of cannabis within your rental property.
Follow up?
Go ahead.
But wouldn't it be safer for the children to disallow it in all multiples because of safety reasons?
I'm not sure that we have the ability to do that.
I think I agree with Manager Crow. I think that the statute is going to restrict our authority to legislate on that point. It specifically leaves open the opportunity and the right for a private landowner, and it calls that out in the statute. It says that nothing shall prohibit private landowners from enacting their own use restrictions as to their properties and as to their tenants. But the authority for local governments to regulate the use of cannabis products is expressly limited to what the state has enacted. So I think by enacting something which requires private landowners to do something, we've probably overstepped the authority granted. I think that it's an excellent point, and I think providing information to constituents and to landowners and landlords in the area is a good idea, to let them know what their options are so that they can make informed choices. But I think for the city to actually legislate would very likely be overstepping.
One more follow-up.
Go ahead.
So the onus of the liability then would fall on the landowner, the landlord?
Yes.
Thank you.
With regards to what we have in front of us, is there a reason the hookah establishment isn't included in this?
Yep. Back to the zoning powers versus the general offenses. So it's the ye may and the thou shalt nots. So zoning is ye may. So you can do these things. We haven't included hookah lounges, therefore you can't do them. So the general offenses code addresses the on-site use. So that's a broader thing, and it says anywhere in the city, if you're going to use cannabis on site in a business establishment or otherwise, either you can't do it, or if you do it, here's the rules.
And just to be clear, at this point, we'd be talking about non-smoking uses, right? Because you can't smoke in any businesses as it is.
Yeah, the short answer is yes. The long answer is we can talk about what the Smoke-Free Workplace Act says and doesn't say, et cetera. But the short answer is it would be really hard for a smoking use to qualify.
Okay. Any other questions, council? I'm not trying to cut anybody short. I know I've asked many. Okay, so what is the staff asking us? I guess Mr. McClanathan had a request that we, did you want to elaborate on the gray areas you wanted to be brought up? You mentioned prior to the next discussion of this?
I think they got fleshed out in the discussion. We're basically talking about on-site consumption in
Which-
general fences.
okay,
So,
great.
thank you.
So at this point, I guess we would need a motion for this to move forward to the next council meeting or be sent back down to a committee, or, so I'm open to hear any motions at this point. Well, I'll make a motion to move this forward to a first reading at a council meeting.
Second.
All right. Mr. Borneman with the lonely first vote, and Mr. Ross second. Any discussion? I guess my point is, if we don't pass this ordinance, we wouldn't be able to allow for sales in the city, correct?
Until it's passed, we don't have any, we don't really have any citing regulations, so it would be unclear.
So there would still be the use of cannabis throughout the city,
Correct.
and the city would see positively no revenue or benefit from that
That's correct.
without passing some type of zoning allowing for sales of it.
Correct.
Okay.
Chair,
Mr. McClanathan?
are you making a motion just to put it on the floor? You're not making a motion with a recommendation for approval or disapproval at this point, correct?
That's right. With no further discussion, do we need a roll on this?
We just need a
Voice vote.
voice vote.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, we will move this forward to council.
For councils, do you want it on the 21st?
First one in November?
Okay.
Is there any hurry or any rush otherwise?
All right. So, 4th of November.
All right, thanks, Attorney Cox. If we're ready, we can move on to the item 11, which is discussion regarding ordinance amending Chapter 659, chronic nuisances, Section 659.02, definition of the Code of Ordinances. Mr. Crow.
So the first ordinance that you have here, I gotta get back to my, to the right ones here, making notes, is to bring in the possession of cannabis and the sale and delivery of cannabis is defined into the act. So it modifies 659.02 to match the act.
Any discussion?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Thank you. And we say 659.02 to mirror the act. You're talking about the state statute, the Cannabis Regulation and
That's
Tax
correct.
Act.
That's correct.
And we really have no choice in that matter, correct?
That's correct. If I'll turn over to Attorney Zito.
Right, so obviously, we have a lot of sections of our code that address cannabis, and all of our sections have it as being illegal. Possession of it's illegal, sale of it's illegal, use of it's illegal. Well, with the adoption of the new legislation that makes cannabis legal, we have to bring all our definitions and everything back into the line to account for the fact that adult use cannabis is permissible. So in this particular section, we're just looking to tweak the definition that says that under the original, it said possession, cultivation, and manufacture is all illegal. Now, how I've tweaked it is to say the illegal use is what's illegal. So, because you could still have situations where it's a minor that's using it, so that's not prohibited under the new law there. So that's why it's phrased the way that it's phrased.
And carrying more than 30 grams.
Sure.
That makes sense to me. There still be multiple situations that could arise where the possession or distribution of cannabis is illegal according to state law, and this just amends our city code to mirror the state law. So, no further discussion.
I have a motion. Yeah, let's motion to move it forward then.
All right.
To the same November, first meeting in November.
Motion by Mr. Parker, seconded by McClanathan. I think we take a voice vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, that will pass and move forward. Next on the topic, the discussion is number 12, discussion regarding ordinance amending Chapter 20, controlled substance abatement.
This is the same thing, bring it in line with the state law.
Okay,
Same motion to move it forward.
all right.
Second.
Motion by Parker, seconded by McClanathan. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? And that will proceed to the next meeting on the 4th. Not the next meeting, but the meeting of the 4th. So that brings us to item 13, which is the discussion regarding ordinance amending Chapter 626, Drugs of the Code of Ordinances. Manager Crowe.
I'm actually going to turn this over to Attorney Zito since he is the drafter of this.
So again, this section of the code basically set forth the offenses that had cannabis possession, drug paraphernalia, it set forth all of that as being prohibited. Well, again, so right now, under the paraphernalia section, we're saying that it's not drug paraphernalia if you are using a particular piece of equipment, I guess, or to ingest cannabis, as long as you're doing it in accordance with the Cannabis Act now. So for example, if you are over 21, you legally have purchased cannabis, using the pipe is no longer drug paraphernalia. But if you're under 21 and you're using it, then it is drug paraphernalia. Then it also goes on then to delete the violation that, delivering, using cannabis is a violation, and it basically mirrors then what the state statute provides as far as personal use of cannabis. So this, all the topics that you've heard here about how many grams can a person possess, at what, the various concentrations and everything like that. It sets forth the fact that you have to be 21 to have cannabis and the such there. So all this language that is in bold and underlined in black is all mirroring the state statute. It does sound from the discussions, though, that the one piece that is missing here, to the extent the council wants to have it in there, is that specific prohibition for the on-site consumption of the consumption lounges, which we can add if that's the direction of council, but before the next meeting.
Chair,
Go ahead.
I'd like to see at least some proposed language along that for our consideration.
Understood.
Thank you, Attorney Zito. Do we have any discussion? Go ahead, Mr. Busker.
I make a motion to move this forward to the meeting of the 4th.
Second.
All right. Motion by Busker, seconded by Parker. No further discussion. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, so that will move forward. Next on the topic, our agenda is public comment. I see one person there.
You're gonna miss the banquet
Yeah, I'm sorry, Tommy, I won't be able to make it.
so what you want me to do if I win the award on the bank?
Well, I'm sure you can bring it to the next council meeting so we can all see it and give you the congratulations you deserve, Tommy.
And I want to know about how, if you got the update about that by the library,
I'm not sure what you asked me.
about that art plaza.
Art Plaza, yeah, it's still under construction, just weather has slowed it up a little bit.
And no one told Matt Summers he does a good job of the police chief at the police department.
Thank you, Tommy. No further public comment. That moves on to, well, I lost the agenda, but I believe that is a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Busker and McClanathan, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, we are in adjournment.